You're listening to the Future Tech Podcast with Richard Jacobs. Future technologies such as artificial intelligence, stem cells, 3D printing, gene editing, Bitcoin, blockchain, the microbiome, quantum computing, virtual reality, and exploring space are much closer than you might think. In fact, many early versions of these technologies are in play right now, and the companies that are using these technologies are the focus of this podcast. My goal for you, the listener, is to learn from these podcasts. You may very well learn something that may change the course of your life for the better, steer you towards a new career, or give you insight into addressing a thorny medical problem. Remember, this podcast and its content is informational in nature only. No medical, tax, legal, financial, or psychological advice is being given. If you've enjoyed the podcast, please listen, subscribe, like, and tell your friends about it. Thank you.
Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Future Tech and Future Tech Health podcast. I have Professor Glenn Cohen. He's a professor of law at Harvard Law School, faculty director at the Petrie-Flom Center for Health Law Policy, Biotechnology, and Bioethics. Glenn, thanks for coming. How are you doing today?
Thank you for having me. I'm doing very well.
Yeah. Well, tell me, what is the main focus of your position? What kind of things are you working on?
Yeah, I juggle a lot of different things, which is what makes life interesting. I'm dual trained in law and in medical ethics with a good dab of philosophy mixed in. So right now, I would say there's two primary things I'm working on, but then I can also mention a few other things that I've done over the years. So the two primary ones are one, artificial intelligence in healthcare, and two, cutting-edge reproductive technologies, including things like gene editing. But in the past, I've also done a bunch of stuff on organ transplantation. I still do some of that now, medical travel, medical tourism, food and drug law, stuff about commodification, the buying and selling of bodily materials, for example, and maybe 6 or 7 other things, the health of football players, translational medicine. It's a real mix, and that's what I love about my job is I get to kind of mix it up.
So what are some of the interesting ethical quagmires or questions that you've seen come up in all these areas you've worked in?
Yeah, okay, so where to start? So I'll start with what's fresh in my mind, which is, let's start with the AI stuff. So a lot of work right now being done on artificial intelligence, in particular of machine learning, and even more particular, I would say, neural net kind of subtype, happening right now in medicine. Everything from trying to determine how likely a patient is to have a negative cardiac event, approving IDXDR, which allows a regular doctor to have the skill of an ophthalmologist in determining whether a patient has or is likely to suffer from diabetic retinopathy and can do a screening test, to deciding whether to put a patient on or to recommend to a patient to be on pre-exposure prophylaxis, which is an anti-HIV attempt to prevent HIV, in particular sexually active people. All of these people are developing and many, many more AI systems to kind of deal with and work on. And so these systems are very interesting. They raise a lot of interesting issues. Among them, how good are the data sets on which they're based? Is there systemic bias in terms of race, gender, class, geographic location, nationality? Questions about whether patients are even aware that their data is being used in this way and what the rules ought to be in terms of using electronic health records in this way, and whether de-identification of electronic health records for these purposes is really possible, whether that's outmoded thinking. Questions about informed consent for patients when these are used on them. Questions on whether FDA or other regulatory agencies in the U.S. should have to pre-clear these algorithms. Questions about what happens if these algorithms are changing over time as you're giving them more training data. And then I think very big questions like what will it be like to be a physician 20 years from now compared to the way it is today? And how are we really positioning physicians to work well with these technologies, or are we still based in kind of an older school approach to being a physician? So that's on the AI front.
Good question there.
I'll stop there for a sec. Yeah, go ahead.
When you talk about bias, I mean, in a lot of conditions, I would think there needs to be bias. If you try to make an algorithm to, talk about how to treat a certain condition, men may act differently than women, or different races may act very differently than other races. So one group may say, "Oh, we don't want bias. We want the data, pseudonymized and no one to know who they're looking at." But they may have to know that, in order. If I'm a black guy, then I want data on this certain condition that has to do with, let's say black men instead of just, Chinese women or something instead, or a mixture, or who knows what.
So that's right, is that what we ideally want, and this is part of the goal of precision medicine, is to be able to give treatment recommendations that are really key to your characteristics. But there's an interesting issue here, is that in machine learning in particular, the characteristics that turn out to be important may not be the ones that are visible or recognizable to us as non-machine thinkers or people who haven't engaged in this kind of very heavy form of pattern recognition. But in terms of these examples, for example, let me give you a real example, which is breast density. Turns out that African American women versus white women have different breast densities, which is relevant when you're looking at a mammogram. But if your algorithm has been trained only on white women and can't make that distinction or can't kind of understand that distinction, you're going to get false positives and false negatives in a way that is kind of predictable. And, one of the old adages in computer science is garbage in, garbage out. So that if the training data is itself not representative of all the communities you want to help, you may run into problems. A different kind of version of this, which is also interesting, has to do with the difference between high resource and low resource settings. That a algorithm trained at what is the best thing to do based on good outcome data in a high resource setting may turn out not work very well in the low resource setting, where your optimal decision or your expectation of follow-up or your expectation of continuity of care is quite different. So we face this problem that these algorithms are, to begin with, quite data hungry in terms of the training data. We would ideally like to have the most representative, broad, and numerous training data sets we can by really using as much electronic health record data as we can. But on the flip side, many patients, and I can understand why, are very kind of upset when they find out, and this is a recent lawsuit that was just launched, alleged allegations the University of Chicago share their electronic health records with Google without asking individual patients one by one. So there's this real trade-off between giving patients autonomy and giving patients privacy about their healthcare data and building training set data that is large and also diverse in terms of who it covers.
So what are some of the things you've seen done to counteract this issue or these issues?
Well, people are really struggling with it right now. I mean, so one thing that's happening is we have what's called the All of Us initiative. It was called the Precision Medicine Initiative, and it's a federally funded attempt to get basically huge amounts of data on a representative sample of the U.S. population to kind of create a reference set. In other countries, they've had a very different approach, which is, for example, in Denmark, I just learned I have a grant that takes me out there sometimes. If you get a genetic test, like a 23andMe type test or a clinical test in Denmark, analyzed in Denmark, whether you like it or not, the information from the test goes into a centralized database that the country is putting together. So they're basically building large set of databases as public databases, with the rationale being, the healthcare system is funded through the tax base, and this is another way in which you contribute if you are someone who benefits from the healthcare system. So those are two very extreme approaches. Other people are trying to give patients some kind of kickback of some sort, although it turns out that individual patient data is not worth all that much. It's kind of pennies on the dollar kind of thing. And it's the aggregation that matters. And then there's attempts to kind of, especially for communities that are skeptical of research, we have a long, bad history of medical research that mistreats African Americans, for example, trying to basically build bridges to be more inclusive and to require certain inclusivity in terms of who participates in research as a condition of funding. So we're doing all of these things at once, but it's not a magic, there's no silver bullet here. And I would also say that there's a lot of just big value questions, like, do you value representativeness of the data set, or do you value autonomy and privacy more? Are there ways in which we can get people to, is opt out the right solution as opposed to opt in? So we see a lot of interesting questions being posed.
Yeah, that sounds very tough. It's funny, on the one hand, you want precision medicine, but in order to get true precision and to really help somebody, you have to know all the underlying assumptions and the data that's being used to help them. And like you said, you need to look at the resources they have and everything. But,
and again, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm not sure where to go with that. I mean, it just sounds like a lot of work to be done. But where do you see things going in the AI realm anyway? Where are they going right now? Are they headed? What direction are they headed in? Or are these questions kind of just being brushed aside for right now?
No, so I think there's something called the hype cycle, which is this very amusing diagram. If you haven't seen it, I recommend Googling it, which is basically this idea that new technologies follow quite a pattern, and there's something called the peak of heightened expectations or something like that. That's followed by the trough of disappointed expectations or something like that. And I think what's interesting is that if you kind of just, used Google Analytics or something like that to look at the numbers of mentions, number of news stories, number of journal articles on AI in medicine, it really is ramping up towards the peak. Very little of it has been implemented into clinical care directly yet, although we're starting to see more of that. Typically with other technologies, though, we reach this peak, everybody's very excited, investment is high, and there's a lot of very well-publicized failures, and then there's a course correction that kind of is a little bit more modest. And I think that's probably, just based on other technologies, that's probably what the future holds for us. But the model of what healthcare looks like, I think, is really under pressure. It used to be a conception of healthcare and research, and they were separate, right? There's researchers and there's doctors. Today, though, the model that governs, I think, in most people's head, just as a design idea, is what's sometimes called the learning healthcare system. And in the learning healthcare system, the idea is that the borders between research and patient care are porous, that we are constantly learning from what we do and doing kind of systematic investigation of kind of the care we're delivering. That systematic investigation changes our hypothesis and changes our views of what's working through research, and then we're feeding it back into clinical care. And so the idea here is that, already we're tracking quite a lot of patient care. We do it less well in this country than many other countries, in part because electronic health records, which are our main repository of health information in this country, are, first of all, not all that interoperable compared to our peer countries, because we have multiple different systems in place. But also they were ultimately designed as billing tools, because that's what we need in this country as a largely private health insurance country. And what you want for the ideal billing tool is a little different than what you want for the ideal medical informatics tool in terms of generating big data sets and the like. So we're trying to kind of build a scaffold of learning healthcare system over what is essentially a system of billing tools. And that has quite a bit of growing pains. I think it's also going to be interesting to see whether, there's a lot of investment in this country in these topics, but whether, in fact, in terms of implementation, there'll be more success in healthcare systems that are a little bit more centralized, like the UK, like Denmark, like a few others, as opposed to the fragmentation of the US healthcare system, where every kind of different hospital system has to make decisions on their own and make buys and stuff like that.
Hey, you know what I just realized? Precision medicine, does that mean it's going to be research-based or is it going to be clinical-based? Ideally, it really needs to be both in order to be good medicine. And if you can't get electronic health records and they're in 18 different places, how are you supposed to apply AI to it effectively? So it sounds like electronic health records really need a kick in the ass. They need to be mandated to be interoperable and, where this data can at least be harvested. Otherwise, it's going to cripple efforts to do proper personalized medicine. This is my observation. It's true, but
and to be fair, Congress has tried a few times to kind of push us in that direction. The problem, a lot of it is lobbying, and the fact that these are powerful companies. It's kind of not a monopoly, but it's kind of an oligopoly, the electronic healthcare record business. And again, in countries where you just have a single buyer, the state healthcare system, much easier for them to decree that everybody use X. The other thing, and I don't know if you know a lot of physicians, but physicians hate the current electronic health records. They really, really hate them. Some of them will admit that it's useful in some ways, but essentially their view is that they kind of, how should I put it? They really contribute. There's a lot of evidence they really contribute to burnout, in the sense that the patients, the physicians basically are spending a huge second shift after they're seeing the patient, adding and inputting data into the electronic health records. And so when these things are very hard to use and hard to collect the data, there's a reason why, physicians are not so excited about investing a lot more in kind of even more widespread data collection. Whereas in countries where they have systems that are kind of more designed for the way medicine is practiced, then I think they've been a lot more successful. So we also have to think about who's going to be entering this data. And again, if the data itself is not good, if it's not accurate, if it's not updated, if it's not being put in kind of in the right way, it's very hard to get out from it what you want.
Yeah, and that'll lead to wrong diagnosis, wrong prescriptions, wrong everything. So it sounds like a dangerous thing if it's not done properly.
Yeah, but always the question is as against what, right? What the status quo is, right? The status quo,
right.
This is what I tell people when they're skeptical of AI, is I remind them, there's this big question about medical AI related to explainability, and this question about, in the General Data Protection Regulation in the EU, they've put in place what's called a right to an explanation. And the idea here is if I can't explain to you why it's recommending X for you, and this is across other domains, not just medicine, that's a problem. So people say that's a problem, call it a right to an explanation. But the truth of the matter is there's tons of things we do right now in medicine that we know that it works. We have no idea whatsoever why it works. So things like aspirin, for example, we really have no idea how aspirin works. And that's kind of crazy if you think about how ubiquitous aspirin is. And we've been okay with that. We tried, but we've been okay with that. So one of the interesting questions is whether we need a paradigm where you understand where everything works, or it's enough to know that it works. Some kind of evidence of accuracy and efficacy.
Gotcha. Well, all right, beyond, there's a lot more, but beyond AI and health records and precision medicine, what were the other areas that you found important ethical considerations?
Exactly. I'm doing a lot on reproductive technologies here. And these are both what I would call old school reproductive technologies, by which I mean, old school is a relative term, but like, assisted reproductive technologies like artificial insemination, sperm donors in most of the world, for example, prohibits anonymous sperm donation. In the U.S., we allow it, but there's a lot of pressure on it based on 23andMe and other direct-to-consumer genetic tests, basically allowing people, even if someone is an anonymous sperm donor, kind of zeroing in on who that person is. So that's one thing. Surrogacy continues to be controversial, even though it turns out that actually very few people in America use it. Questions about pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, which is an attempt to biopsy an early embryo and basically make determinations about certain kinds of disorders and diseases before you decide which ones to implant. So that's the old school stuff. But then the newer school stuff that's very interesting, cutting edge, is uterus transplant. So actually allowing them without a uterus or whose uteruses are diseased to receive a uterus donation, like a kidney donation from another woman. And the questions about that may be a possible future actually where men could have uteruses implanted on their pelvises, which are fascinating. Questions about gene editing, a lot of controversies about that. We can talk about that. Questions about mitochondrial replacement, which is where you basically have what's sometimes called three-parent in vitro fertilization. You take one woman's mitochondria and another woman's nuclear DNA and put them together with a man's sperm. Questions about, this is my favorite, it makes people go crazy when I tell them they don't believe it's true, in vitro gametogenesis, or IVG, which basically takes adult cells like skin cells off of your body and can induce them to become sperm or egg. So we could derive sperm or egg from your skin. We've done this in animals. We haven't done it in human beings yet. We've successfully done it in animals, including allowing two female animals to reproduce. So one of the females produces a sperm and one of them produces an egg, which is amazing. So all of these are kind of bubbling up right now in the last 5 to 10 years. Also egg freezing, which is another kind of interesting controversy. And I spend a lot of time thinking and writing and talking about these.
Well, what if someone wants to, have a kid with themselves, culture two of their skin cells, one sperm, one egg? Is that even allowed?
So there's an interesting question. So right now in the United States, these technologies, so IVG, for example, would probably have to go get approval from FDA, and FDA has taken the position that it will not allow anything that involves germline alteration. So in the US, you can't do it. We have these debates about cloning. It's a little bit of a different mechanism. In cloning, you're basically taking the exact same organism and reproducing it. So the idea that you could be the parent to someone who's genetically similar to you. But, people have very strong reactions to this. And I think it's sort of interesting just to figure out why it bothers us so much. I think it's obviously different than the way reproduction is traditionally done. And if you have religious beliefs, that might be a reason why you don't like it. But in terms of kind of secular morality, what is it about being a parent to offspring that have the same genes as we do that is so disturbing, right? Especially if we believe, I think we should, give them identical twins, that in fact, a lot of the inputs to who we become are way beyond our genes. And I don't know if there's such a compelling reason why somebody would want to do this, as opposed to these others where there might be reasons to avoid infertility, to avoid passing on a disease, where the argument for the technology is very compelling. Here it's hard to kind of tell a compelling story why you ought to be able to reproduce without anybody else's genes involved. But I think the knee-jerk reaction and horror at it is super interesting. And I often think about Freud and kind of discussions about the incest taboo and stuff like that, and whether there's something very kind of deep in our collective unconscious about these things.
You could do very strange things, actually. Like you still need someone to carry the baby. So, a woman could do it completely on her own, but a man couldn't. You would need the help of the woman. But, you could have scenarios where, I don't know why, but the woman could say, I want my skin cell to become sperm, and the man could say, I want my skin cell to become egg, and they still have a baby together, but it's swapped. I wonder what that would do.
Yep. Yeah,
do all kinds of strange things.
And I think it's interesting because, what I like about this stuff is, my partner often says that I work at the intersection of kind of law and science fiction. So I'm interested in that which is just one step away. And this is a good example of a perfect, it would make a great science fiction short story about trying to tell a story about why these people wanted to do this. In the more immediate present, the main reason people want to use these kinds of technologies is they typically carry a very bad disease. For example, mitochondrial diseases, which have terrible effects on the children born. But they also want to be a genetic parent to their own child, right? They don't want to basically just get donor egg and donor sperm. So the idea is this is going to give them a way to both be a genetic parent but avoid the diseases. And I think these cases are much easier to understand why people want to do it, and the case for them much stronger. But in the United States currently, unlike in the UK, you can't use mitochondrial replacement therapy to have two women produce an egg that will be fertilized by a man to avoid this. And so there's interesting questions about whether people will go abroad for it and why we act this way and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah, I guess, again, I can think of all kinds of strange scenarios. I don't know, a group of, I don't know if this is possible, but, what if a group of 50 people all wanted to pool parts of their DNA to make one person? I don't know. I don't know why you would do that, but I guess there's all kinds of strange things that could happen from this, and we don't know who's going to want to do what, and what'll be possible. But I guess the tools are being created to do all kinds of strange mixes.
And again, it'd be better if we lived in a system where it was easier to control once you have the technology, easier to control its deployment. So in the UK, for example, they have an agency that the Human Fertilization and Embryology Authority that's involved with kind of licensing individual clinics and has a lot of control from the government as to what's done. In the US, we have a much more decentralized approach to reproductive technologies. One of the reasons why we've long been a place where people come for reproductive technologies. In many countries, even in Europe, for example, if you're a single person or a lesbian or gay couple, it was unavailable for you to get surrogacy or even IVF. And so people came to the United States. We were kind of this place for reproductive refugees, if you will. So it'll be interesting to see, but the fact that we've had a relatively, comparatively speaking, laissez-faire attitude towards the governance of reproductive technologies also means that we kind of have trouble separating out problematic uses from permitted uses. And there are ways to do this. So Congress could change the current statute that says that FDA can't accept anything that involves germline modification, to basically say, but not mitochondrial replacement therapy for this reason. That's something I and other people have been pushing for. Congress could do that, and then FDA could review protocols involving just the mitochondrial replacement therapy, but not the germline gene editing. But so far we've been unsuccessful in getting Congress to revisit this, and that's because they don't have a particularly nimble approach to regulating reproductive technologies. Instead, it's very all or nothing here in the United States.
Well, when do you think it's going to get to the point where something has to be done? Otherwise, we're going to get a lot of unexpected, unhappy results.
Well, I think already, a lot of people view. I think one of the interesting questions will be whether we are forced into a different situation by the activities of our peer countries. So already on mitochondrial replacement, there is a gap. On gene editing, there's not a gap now, and that basically across the world, gene editing is illegal, but probably it will happen in a few places where the regulatory system is less strong. And of course, it did happen in China, and there's some disputes about whether the authorities were aware or not aware and stuff like that. Yeah, so, of course, there's this case of Dr. He, who is the scientist in China who kind of announced to the world, shocked the world by saying, I've actually gone ahead and done gene editing for the first time ever. And everybody, I think that I know, views that as quite an ethical thing he did, in part because he chose a very strange thing to edit, one where there was no need necessarily to do an edit. It wasn't a very serious need, not medical, not great preclinical data, not clear he had skill, not clearly informed consent. So there's a lot of reasons that it was bad. But in reaction to this kind of thing, there's typically a first reaction that I'll say is like very forceful, and it's basically prohibit, prohibit, prohibit. And that's kind of where we are in this conversation now. I think what will happen is that we'll see use cases that are much more compelling. We'll see preclinical data that's much better. We'll see a process, and we'll see other countries start to open the door a little bit. And when that happens, I think there'll be a lot more pressure on the United States to kind of re-examine where we are and start making more fine-grained distinctions to replace what looks like a sledgehammer in terms of regulation with something that looks a lot more like a scalpel.
So what does this look like? I don't know. What does regulation look like to you 10 years out? Hopefully not longer. But
I think what it is it's basically giving approval for certain very specific forms of germline gene editing. I think it has a multi-generational follow-up. I think it has to be extremely serious disorders. I think it has to be kind of things where we've done a little bit more of a deliberative democracy exercise to understand what the people, what the country really thinks. But I think it does allow for the most serious disorders where we have the most confidence of the edit we can make, where we know how to make the edit, where we agree to do it in a limited number of people and track the results over time. That's what I think the more permissive regime looks like. But it's hard to get there when you start with a world of no. And indeed, it's interesting, a lot of the rhetoric, I just wrote a paper on this, a lot of the rhetoric about germline gene editing right now strongly resembles the rhetoric around in vitro fertilization in the 1970s and 1980s. And I think one of the questions is there we kind of were able to, it got through in England without a lot of regulation. Even in the United States, there was some congressional debate and ethics committees and stuff like that. But there was a big impasse there. That kind of made it so that nobody really said, oh, God, you have to regulate this and you have to figure this up ahead of time, and we have to have this long conversation. So I think one of the interesting things is whether we could imagine a future where some forms of germline gene editing are treated the same way we do in vitro fertilization, or whether instead we will always associate this kind of work with kind of Nazi experiments.
what about if there's real the technology continues to develop very quickly, and there is no comprehensive legislation? What does the landscape look like then? Do we see a big pressure to make designer babies, things like that? I mean, what does it look like to you then?
I mean, right now we're in a state of flat-out prohibition, and I think that chances are that's where we'll stay until we move to something a little more gentler. Now, there's what's called the biohacking community, which is kind of interesting, which are people who say, hey, I don't care about your regulation, right? I'm going to alter my body or alter my children. One of the questions is how easy this becomes to do and whether this becomes kind of garage DIY genomics at some point. I think that that's probably unlikely for the germline editing. For the somatic editing, where you're editing, more likely to edit an adult, for example, I think there's more of a question about whether that's a possibility. And there's a group of people who really think it's my right to do what I want with my body, and what I want to do with my body is to edit my genome. And so I think there's some pressure there. And again, when it comes to this biohacking movement, countries have taken very different approaches. But when it comes to germline editing, it's becoming easier and easier to do, requires less sophistication, but still requires considerable amounts. And there's questions about whether control over imports and exports, for example, and other things can be used effectively as a way of reining it in. The WHO, the World Health Organization, has recommended a registry recently for all gene editing, somatic, and germline, all experiments. So I think it's a good first step because we really don't know everything that's out there.
Okay. Do you see do you think the future is more dystopian, or that we're going to find our way and, things will make sense? And again, we'll have this technologies available for limited but important cases. And what are your thoughts on what will likely happen?
So I'm a techno-optimist. I think it's my normal state of being. I also have a lot of skepticism about biological and genetic exceptionalism. And let me put it this way. I think probably the introduction of the iPhone has been more of a disruption. If we look at the history of our civilization and where it was going and where it's going now, and in terms of things that have had unexpected side effects and really changed the way, I think the iPhone has had much more of a disruptive effect, and its successors, smartphones in general, on our civilization than I could imagine gene editing having in the foreseeable future. And yet, it's only been a very short period of time that we've had these technologies. When I went to law school, I didn't even have a cell phone, let alone a smartphone, and I'm not that old. And, I think that what's interesting is that kind of tech, and there's some back and forth now about this vis-a-vis Facebook and the like, that kind of tech doesn't require these kind of pre-market clearance or these long conversations about where it is we should be going and international treaties and stuff like that. And I think for me, it's kind of an interesting thing that we really don't, know what's going to really be disruptive for our society. And I tend to think we tend to focus perhaps on the wrong things because they are tangible and obvious. And in particular, I think the biological makes us fearful in a way that the non-biological, the technological doesn't. So if you ask me, which is the technology to have worried about? Had you asked me a while ago, I would not have said, oh gosh, worry about the iPhone. So now that we're here now, I just think they've changed our society dramatically. Now, for good and for ill, there's amazing things that you can do. When I go and I feel like I don't have to sit in front of my computer the way I used to when I started my career. And I think that's amazing. When I think about people with childcare needs, when I think about the idea of coming in and out, I think that's wonderful. When I think about workaholism, when I think about attention span, when I think about traffic accidents, it's terrible. But to me, I think that we're very bad at predicting things that are going to be incredibly disruptive. And so, and for the most part, when I look at the society my parents lived in or the society my grandparents lived in, I feel pretty happy to be living today. And I hope that my grandchildren and my children will have the same reaction in the future. Now, there's some things that are existential threats, like climate change, where I think we're probably not spending enough of our time thinking about it. But I'd be much more worried about iPhones and climate change than I would of gene editing. But that's me.
Okay. Well, very good. Well, what's the best way for people to get in touch and hear more of your thoughts or read papers or, communicate?
Yeah. So you can find me on the Harvard Law School website. Just look under faculty. And then you can also follow me on Twitter. I'm at Cohen Prof, COHENPROF. So at Cohen Prof. You might also want to check out the center that I'm the faculty director of, the Petrie-Flom Center. It's not just me there, but a number of scholars and people, policymakers, doing great work. And we've got a great listserv that you can sign up for if you want to see what's going on. We put almost every event we do online as a video. So even if you're not in Cambridge, Massachusetts, you can be part of the community.
Okay, well, that's great. Well, I appreciate you coming on the podcast and your thoughts.
Thank you so much.
You're listening to the Future Tech Podcast with Richard Jacobs. Future technologies such as artificial intelligence, stem cells, 3D printing, gene editing, Bitcoin, blockchain, the microbiome, quantum computing, virtual reality, and exploring space are much closer than you might think. In fact, many early versions of these technologies are in play right now, and the companies that are using these technologies are the focus of this podcast. My goal for you, the listener, is to learn from these podcasts. You may very well learn something that may change the course of your life for the better, steer you towards a new career, or give you insight into addressing a thorny medical problem. Remember, this podcast and its content is informational in nature only. No medical, tax, legal, financial, or psychological advice is being given. If you've enjoyed the podcast, please listen, subscribe, like, and tell your friends about it. Thank you.